Good afternoon. Hello, hello, hello. I would like to welcome all of you here. It's always so good to get together with all of my fellow volunteers. And today, first thing, I am going to introduce Stephanie Ray. And Stephanie is the chairman of our quilt show, and she would like to say a few words. Stephanie?
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how many of you were here in the old days when the quilt show was the big event at the village, and for years the auction of the raffle for a Amish-made quilt at the quilt show was the only fundraiser the village had. So things have come a long way. So we are reinstating the quilt show. March 1st through April 4th, we will have quilts in every building, we think. We're going to set up on Monday, the 28th, but any help would be appreciated. And we will be taking it down on Monday, April 4th. So it will be here a while. We have now a new thing. We used to hang them, if you remember, the largest number were hung in the Bailey store from the rafters all the way around. Spectacular, but really difficult to do. And then we aren't doing that anymore. We do have some nice frames that have been ordered that we're going to be able to use to hang quilts. We hope in Bailey store and maybe in Shore Haven. I hope we get some help. We would love to have some help. We're going to meet on Tuesday, February 15th, to pick out the quilts we will hang. We have about 40 or so quilts in our own collection. In the old days, people loaned us quilts for the quilt show, and so we would have as many as 85 quilts to show. Which again was great, but then we are no longer doing that for insurance reasons and lots of reasons. We quit doing that actually before we had the last quilt show. We are going to have hopefully printed up a quick history of the quilt show that will be available in Shore Haven, and that will also include a nice concise history of quilting in the United States. As we put the quilts out for display, we'll have a wide variety of quilts. And some of the more unusual ones or some of the ones we acquired in an unusual way, we'll have a short history with them. And every quilt will be named. We're going to have a quiz that can be picked up and people can carry around with them, trying to find the quilt that matches a quilt pattern. And we are going to have some nice, we hope, things in the gift shop relating to quilts. In the old days, we used to have, we'd have like coloring books that had quilts and different things. And the most popular thing we ever had was a little kit, a quilt kit that people could buy and have everything in it to put together a quilt block. So we'll see. Nancy's looking at it. Yeah. So thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy the quilt show. I hope you will pick up the short history of the quilt show and kind of familiarize yourself with the quilts that will be in the different buildings and the histories they have with them. And I hope it's as big a success as it was in the past. There were years where people planned their week on Sanibel to be here during the Village Quilt Show. And there'd be articles about it in magazines and all this. It was a kind of famous thing.
Stephanie, with you in charge, I know it's going to be fantastic.
Well, we'll have to see.
And I know Sandy will put something out so to remind us and so we can sign up and everything.
Yeah. Thank you all very much. And I'll see you in a month.
It was a huge show. We had people coming that would do field trips from Sarasota and Punta Gorda.
So we won't be quite back at that level this year, but maybe we will get there in a few years and it'll be a big event again. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Our fellow volunteer, Bonnie Frankel, shared a very special quote with us yesterday. She said that the quote was that if you really care for a place, you need to know its story. Well, our village is the storyteller for our islands. A while back, a group of us were talking, and we realized that our buildings had a lot of stories yet to tell. So we started doing a research on each of our buildings and put together new timelines. And today we'd like to share with you the highlights of these timelines. And you can follow along in your packet. We're going to go right along with the order your packet's in. And Annette, you're going to share on Morning Glories.
So Morning Glories, you're all familiar with Morning Glories. It was built in 1926, but the land was purchased in 1924 by Martin Mayer. And I found that by going into the Lee County tax collector records, which, if you want to know about real estate, of course, that's where we all go, LIPA.org. And there is a special way in which you can put in years and the name that you're looking for. So I thought I was going to have to make a special request. It comes right up, all of the land transactions that were made, and I looked from 1924 to 1926. Then Morning Glories was built. It is a Sears home. It's the honor-built home. Was quite expensive, $22,211, but that doesn't include all of the built-in cabinets, the kitchen, and the fireplace. Daisy Meyer, that was 1926. For a long time then, Martin and his wife passed away early, but Daisy, when Martin passed away in 1958, the building was purchased from the estate by Daisy Meyer. Daisy Meyer was one of the people, was the wife of Ross, who lived in Shore Haven. So she picked up that property. In 1966, she passed the house to her daughter, Grace Meyer Zimrowski. And Grace then passed it to her daughter, Allison Zimrowski, and now we're into the generation that we know because Allison is Ty Zimrowski's sister, if you know Ty. And in 1999, it was still over on the bay, the land was sold, and Morning Glories was donated to the Historical Museum. So it's pretty straightforward. It's a wonderful little house. Any questions? Okay.
Question, someone raise their hand in the back. No?
I had the good fortune of working on the Bailey store. And there is a question, do we call it the 27 Bailey store, the 26 Bailey store, or because I remember when I first became a volunteer here, Sam would refer to it as the 26 Bailey store. And I got used to hearing it that way, but actually the Bailey store was blown down in the 26 hurricane, and it wasn't rebuilt and reoccupied till 27. So I think what we've decided to do is call it the second Bailey store, and that suffices for an awful lot. There's a few little quirks about the second Bailey store. First of all, apparently Frank Bailey or Francis got a real good deal on seafoam green paint because it was always painted seafoam green, along with the Charlotta's Tea Room that was right next door, because Ray Rhodes, who will speak to us next month, lived in the tea room, and he was saying it was always seafoam green also. Also, the Bailey store always had it had a stalk of bananas hanging from one of the rafters. That was just part of it. And the Bailey store, Frank really ran it
that
until
store.
the late 40s.
Excuse
He
me?
was running
Hairdresser.
into a health
How
problems,
did
and
they
it was really a
build
very tough
the
time for the
Bailey
store.
store
He was
so
almost
big?
ready to sell it,
There
and
is
that's
a-
when
a
Francis
side
came
to
back
that story.
and started working in the store and more or less took over.
The-
So
the
that's
only
what
hairdresser
really
on
saved the
the
store.
island at
And
the
they
time
had one
was
thing that,
Mary
again, in
Ann.
talking to Ray Rhodes, he said that
And
really
she
pulled the store
built
out and was really a big profit item.
earned all
In the
that land
50s,
where they
kids
lived.
were really a big
Her, she built
but they were expensive,
building.
so they
It
were
wasn't
able to get
quite
some
finished
knockoffs
when we had
imported
the
from
store.
outside
And
the
she
country someplace.
almost
And the big
questioned-
deal
there's a
was
whole
they
story
would order
there.
them in
I'll
May and
go
hope to
into it.
goodness they got
Bailey
here by
moved
November,
into that
because
building
then
and
they
she
would
was
have the
gonna get
kids,
to
the
the
knockoffs of the kids,
But
because they always
she's got
sold
the
those
photograph.
and
Her
made
daughter
a
is still a hairdresser on there.
lot of profits on it.
And
then we
she
moved to that. The Bailey
has all the
store
photographs and
was
all
here
the
from
information to back it
1927,
up.
actually
I won't
20
go into it
again.
now,
We
but
say
I-
27
but
until
they couldn't have built that building
1966,
as
and then in
quick from
66 it
1956 to
moved to its present
1957.
location.
So there's a whole gap
Bay.
in your history.
And
You can
then
find
from
out.
1966 to
A whole gap in the
1960,
Because her daughter, who is
1967 to
Mary Ann,
1968,
is still a
Adeline
hairdresser.
Bailey,
She's got
which
all the
was
information.
Francis's second
I've told
wife.
her that she should come talk
They
to
were
me.
married
Yes,
in
she's still
1966. Were married
working,
for
but I
8
think
years.
we
But
could.
Francis's second wife,
Yes, that'd be
Adeline,
wonderful. But there's a
opened
gap in the
Red
Mr.
Car
Lotta's
in,
No, no.
story.
from how
This was an
quickly-
island import
after
store, and they sold all
September
kinds of
1926
import
storm,
items and all kinds of
how
more or
quickly
less
that
Fiji,
building where Bailey
Caribbean type
built
things.
has never
And
been touched.
she
But
was
it's-
very
It's
artistic.
very knowledgeable.
And,
If we
in
can
fact,
get
her
her
father
to talk about it.
played
I've seen
John
the
Philip
photographs
Sousa's
at the
band.
hairdresser.
So
I've got
the
it.
family
well, we need
was
to get
very
her.
hardy.
Her name is
And
Mary Ann
anyway,
something else. It's not still in Halley.
Excuse me?
her
Banta,
son,
is her
Will
last name.
Compton,
Yeah,
who
just that
presently
beauty.
just lives right off
Well,
island.
we need that story, don't we? We are.
Leader on the island just recently brought a whole bunch of pictures of Adeline and shared them with us. And these are things that history we really had to dig up, because we found, and as I'll tell you just real quickly, Adeline was very involved in a lot of things. When we move on to she moved her Red Pelican store down to Tarpon Bay by the store by the Bailey store in 1968. And then the next occupant of the Bailey store was the Island School of the Dance, and that was operated by Coralie Rumbold. And Coralie came here from Minnesota. Her father, her parents came here from Minnesota. She and her sister came here with the parents. And Coralie had been highly trained as a ballerina in Minneapolis, where they came from. Coralie's father built the Kona Kai. So anyway, after Coralie got here, she set up her ballet school in the Bailey store, and she had 2 really outstanding recitals. Recitals were held at the community center, and I got to talk to her recently, and she has sent us, we have programs and everything else, and pictures of what the Bailey store looked like when it was set up as a dance studio and all. And we have all the familiar names on the island: the Woodrings, the Baileys, the Rushworths. All of these daughters were involved in this school of the dance. And again, it was a very high caliber school of the dance. It wasn't just little chapeau ball change and whatever that way. These girls were really trained. And then another interesting thing, when I told Coralie, she was talking to Coralie, she said her most popular class was she taught hula lessons to the island ladies. And she said she'd have 20 in her class, and she said she always had people lined up for sign-ups. So anyway, the island ladies were taking hula dancing. And also, Adeline, being the artist she was, Francis's wife, she painted all the sets for the School of Ballet. And then in 1973, the Bailey store became the first location for the Children's Center of the island. And it was there until 1981. And again, Adeline had a lot to do with setting up the Children's Center of the island. And also a familiar name when you go back and look at some of the fundraisers for the Children's Center of the Island, and when it was here and then when it moved up to Cassie Bell, was Mariel Goss. Remember, Mariel Goss was the one that was responsible, she and her two friends, for our bike paths. So these names keep crossing. The most interesting thing that I was not aware of at all, you'll notice at the same time the Children's Center of the Island was in the Bailey store, also there was an office for the Police Recreation Center. And this center was a 501c3 organization which offered activities for island kids and was instrumental in raising funds for the Sanibel School and the Recreation Center swimming pool. They had to earn money each year to put on their recreation. They had a sailing school, they had swimming classes, etc. that way. They made their money by putting together and selling a Sanibel Island phone book every year, and they made $30,000 in this. Then they really wanted to have a swimming pool on the island that everyone could use, a community swimming pool. So they went together with city council matching funds, and they raised the 350, well, together it was matching funds, so it would be about, I think they raised about $175 for the swimming pool and the small building that was beside it, like the office and the changing room and everything. So it was the Police Recreation Center that was responsible for the pool that we now have that's down by our recreation center. And altogether, that pool cost $350,000, but it was a combined effort of Sanibel City Council and the Police Recreation Group. So anyway, and there has been stories, and it's an ongoing thing, there's been stories that there was actually some sort of a gym in the Bailey store after Children's Center of the Island left, but I haven't got any definitives on that yet, so tune in next time, we'll see what we have. Yes? The store was still on right down here. The store was always located right at the end of Bailey Road on the bay until it was moved here in, well, here again, we have discrepancies in dates. Some places say 91, some places say 92. We have 92 here on the timeline now until we can really investigate it more. But it was always down at the end of Bailey Road. Yes?
Is there any thought of painting the Bailey store seafoam green?
I don't think there is right now, no. We'll have to look into that.
I mean, for historic,
For historic things, yes, that's right. Okay, I'm sorry for taking so much time. And next we have the post office. And Mr. Kevin.
This presentation should not be published. Everything in it is hearsay. And it's hearsay from people on the island that have been here for years and years and years. I did not go to that place that you mentioned. I just talked to the people here. Who here remembers Coconut Grove? Hands up. Oh my God, I'm worried. Newbies, okay. Yes, that's a good thing. The timeline on the post office is correct, so I will not go through it again, if you don't mind. Thank you. However, at the end, it's wrong. If you will just go in the post office, put your head up, and it says 1979, the year of Jimmy Carter. That's when it was put there. So that's incorrect. As docents, I don't think the people give a hoot. Secondly, more importantly, after 1969, who remembers the old post office deli? You do. We talked about it. Now, how do I know about it? I can't tell you because they're all dead. However, it did not last long. And the reason it didn't last long is because they had this mad music going. When we would walk in with my wife, they'd tone it down. Food good? Not too good. What happened after that? This does not have to go into your docent thing because it doesn't make any difference. It was the Tarpon Bay Sushi. Now, how long did that last? Maybe a couple of months. After that, it was the Tarpon Bay hot dogs. Oh boy, that lasted, sure. Then in '04, Amy's Over Easy was instituted. That got that name then. After the hurricane, that's when that came in. Now in '07, there was a tragedy in that family, and I know what it is, and you don't want to know what it is. Another family took it over, and is now, if you look, it's called the Amy Over Lightly. So those are the only corrections, and because I have an email here from Gail Pence that said you cannot go over 5 minutes. I'm done.
And there's a headstone or something that marks it?
Yes, yes.
Oh, wow.
It's actually in the information center that the bike club put together, you know, a number of years ago.
The tea room
Yes,
is
and
the
Mary,
favorite
I
of
will
many,
throw
many
in,
people. And
it's
as you know, there is
almost
one
certain
date in our
that
village
as the
that
headstone
so much
says he was
revolves around,
born
and
in
that's
England, he was
1926.
not.
And the tea
So
room is
I
no
don't know if that
exception.
comes from a Clarence
Around that
tale,
time,
but
at the beginning of
he was not born in England, and
New
it
York
is
cars were
engraved
coming over
forever.
Frank Bailey with the Bailey store at the end of the war.
Well,
or the
Clarence,
dock
well, and
decided
actually dropped
they
out of
needed more
school
fuel
after
than
the
his
third
small
grade.
pumps could.
And at that time,
And so in 1926,
he was making
he
7
built
cents
a
an
filling
hour
station. And
packing
if you look
vegetables and
at the tea
tomatoes
room
with
and
the
in
Sanibel
store,
Pike Packing
there's that
Company.
overhang.
7
So
cents
the
an
tea
hour.
room was built as a
At the
filling
age of
station
about 9 or
to
10.
go on land at
So
the
that
end
was
of
the
the
extent
dock
of his
when all was
education.
well. Except in September
In
of
1900, he
1926,
married
everything
lighthouse
changed.
keeper
Everything
Henry
was
Shanahan,
the dock, the store at the end of the dock. everything
Irene, and she
went
was
away
the
in the
widow with
hurricane.
5 children.
So Miss
So this blended
Charlotta's
family ended up
never
being
became
13
that
children.
gas station.
It
It
was
became the
large.
store for a year, the temporary Bailey
And
store
at
for that
about
year.
that time,
Until
too,
1927, the store
the
we know
Rutland
today
House,
was
let me
built.
back up and say, the
And
Rutland
Frank
House
Bailey,
is a typical
who
cracker
had
style
married
architecture.
Annie Bailey,
One central long
excuse me,
hall,
Annie
high
Matthews,
ceilings,
had
rooms
given,
across,
gave
windows,
the tea
rooms and windows
to
across from each
Annie's
other.
sister,
No air
Charlotta.
conditioning. The air
And
conditioning
Charlotta
was
used it as
opening the
tea
front and
room
back
we
door.
need today.
That was
And
it.
it's interesting, when I was just kind of looking at stuff over there are no pictures
As
of
I
the
said,
interior
August
of the
7th,
tea room,
1916,
which is really interesting. No
Clarence
pictures that we
Rutland,
know of.
the third
And then
son
the kids
of this blended
were
family,
not allowed in because
Mary's
of
Ruth,
being too
Mary's
sandy and
Ruth
gritty and wet and all the
Wiles in
reasons that
Spalding
kids aren't
County,
allowed in.
Georgia.
Today we haven't
And
changed a lot
in
on that, but
1928,
it was only
Clarence
for the women.
purchases the house.
Departures, arrivals of the
And
island
after
women.
to do that,
And the men built a small.
he got a loan from Frank Bailey for $1,800. The house cost $80 to build.
I would call it a par three.
80,
Remember,
80 to build,
wasn't even
but he bought it for
Remember,
1,800.
oh, what was
And
that?
he says that he
Remember when
bought
it
this house
it
at the
didn't have
end
the
of
grills
World
and
War
fancy
I,
things for miniature
and
golf. It
very
was just
slowly
simply
paid it
lining up
off
us, and it was
at
more
the
like
end
that.
of World War II.
So, Miss
So
Charlotta
it
ran
was
the
hard for him
things,
to
and
come up with
Sam
this money.
always told us he called her Shabun, because she never married. She helped
While
rear
he
those
was
3
living in
Bailey
the house,
boys
this is
who
another
were
little
orphaned when our
Clarence Rutland
Sam
fact.
and Francis
He
was gone.
sold,
Sam was
he
12.
sold arc
And
shells.
Charlotta
And
was a,
in that long hallway
surrogate
in the
mother to
house,
the-
there were
those
these
boys
barrels
had
of
lots
arc
of
shells
boys.
there. Kind
Nature,
of
of course,
making
vacuum,
point of
and
this.
those
But he
boys
sold
had
them
a
to
lot of
Thomas
love for
Edison.
many women, but
For,
Charlotta
and
was
to make
totally
walkways
Thomas
over at the Edison Estate.
She operated the tea
for
room
50 cents
until
for
the
60
Kinsey
pounds
brothers
of arc shells.
moved the
When he
ferry
raised the price to
from
$1 for
wharf
60 pounds of
as
arc shells,
where the store was
Thomas
and where the
Edison
tea
said
room
that was too expensive.
They
He
moved
wasn't
into
buying
Ferry
any more.
Landing in
So
1935.
I don't know about
And,
Clarence's marketing
Charlotta then
skills.
just lost all her customers.
That's
And she
That's how much
closed
were they,
the tea
they
room
sold in
in
initially for how
1935.
many? 60?
And it then
50
became a
cents
business.
for 60
It
pounds.
was
of
perfectly
arc
good, and
shells.
as you know, in
You
Sanibel,
wonder where all the arc shells
repurposed
went.
everything. The school teacher lived there for a while, and oh, let's see, the Redinger.
And sadly, in
Redingers,
1958,
the,
you know, he and Ruth,
and Mark Helen was
as
the
I
last
said,
one.
were married,
And Deb
had no
Gleason,
children
our own
of their
Deb
own
Gleason,
after
who
coming
many of
from
you
this
know,
blended
she
family
grew
of
up on the
13.
island. She's
But I think every child on the
archival
island thought
work
of
for us,
Clarence
and,
as Uncle
she's a
Clarence.
realtor,
And they
her
would be
parents
wandering
came
through the house all the
to
time.
Captiva when she was
But
a little
sadly,
girl to
Ruth
run
passed
amok
away in
them. So Deb
1958,
is
and
iconic
Clarence
here. And I saw
lived
this
until
really
the
cute
early
picture of her in
80s.
cutoffs and
By
she's just-
himself.
and I said, and I was
And
at
the
station 2
Sanibel
that day. I said,
Historical
Deb,
Museum and Village
what is the
moved
story
the
of
Rutland
you?
House here.
You
It
lived
was
in Miss
actually the
Charlotte's.
first
And she said,
building to
yes,
come to
Blair,
the
but you've got to
museum.
talk to other people. I was
And,
living in sin, and you don't want that story.
Sadly,
I said, yes, I
everything
do.
in the entire house that belonged
So
to Clarence
many
is his
emails
rocking
and
chair.
phone calls, and
All
and
the
we
other
kept
furniture
missing
and
each
goods
other.
in the
And I
house
said,
are
Deb, I
of
don't
the
think you're this
period,
busy.
but
Tell
it's
me the
only his
story.
rocking
I don't
chair
have the story for
that
you.
belonged to him.
But
And if you sit
Deb
you
lived
have to sit
in
in
Miss
it. But
Charlotta's
if you
as a
look
young
at that
woman
rocking
apparently for
chair,
quite a while. So
and it wouldn't be hard to guess that Clarence wasn't more than
Excuse
5'4"
me?
or 5'5". It's just a tiny chair, but it's beautifully inlaid with shells and turquoise and gorgeous. Any questions about the Rutland House?
Hairdresser on the island at the time was Mary Eck. And she built all, owned all that land where Bailey is. She built that building. It wasn't quite finished when we had the storm. And she almost pressured, and there's a whole story there, I won't go into it, Bailey into moving into that building because she was going to give it to Jim. But she's got the photograph. Her daughter is still a hairdresser on the island, and she has all the photographs and all the information to back it up. And I won't go into it now. You've got other things to say, but they couldn't have built that building as quickly from 1926 to 1957. So there's a whole gap in your history that you can find out if you.
a whole gap in the Miss
Because
Charlotte.
her daughter, who is Mary Ann, is still a hairdresser, and she's got all the information. I've told her that she should come and talk to me.
Yes,
She's still working, but I think we could just,
yes, that'd be wonderful. But there's a gap in the Miss Charlotta's
no,
story.
how quickly, after
Yes.
September 1926 storm,
Okay.
how quickly that building where Bailey built it has never been discussed. But it's very knowledgeable if we can get her to talk about it. I've seen the photos at the hairdresser.
Okay. Well, we need to get her then.
Her name is Mary Ann something else. It's not still an address.
Excuse me? Fanta. Okay. Well, we need that story, don't we? We are always looking.
The more we investigate, the more pieces we have to put together. We go from a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle to 1,000.
We used to have, and we may still have it over in Rutland, we used to have a 3-ring binder that just had notebook paper in it and a pen. And people would just write us stories. And we learned more anecdotes. You know, it just was a real simple thing.
There was a man, not to interrupt you.
Oh,
There was
please.
a man in the store last week, and my friend Robin Coleman was working in the store, and it was a man and his wife. And the man, he was in Rutland House, and he said to Robin, Jesus, I need a bottle of bourbon, because Clarence and I used to sit here and drink. So, I mean, you hear stuff like that all the time.
It's great, and we need to write it all down. We do, but
Yeah.
yeah, that would solve that. Anyway, Rutland House, as you know, was the beginning of in 1984, and this house was moved in 1991. The tea room was moved from the bay. As I tell my people on tours, all the action on Sanibel in the day that we cover was to the right of the causeway as you come on the island. If they can just envision down there. And I took my bike down there a while ago to look for the old plaques that used to be in, no. So there's a kind of, at the end of Bailey Road, there's a nice storyboard there. But that's where kind of stuff happened. And so Miss Charlotta's tea room was restored by John's Angels, who I am assuming, like the Hammerheads today, and they did it. And that is the fun of Miss Charlotta's. Any questions?
As you can see on the timeline, Sam Woodring was the one that built Burnap Cottage on Woodring Point. However, in some of our early docent, and it's probably still there, it always said that Sam Jr. was the one that built the cottage. But we believe that it was Sam Sr. He died the next year, but he was the one that built the original homestead on Woodring Point. And it was a big two-story building that later became, after his death, a boarding house run by Sam Sr.'s wife, Anna. But Sam Jr. wasn't old enough and didn't have the carpentry skills probably to have been the builder of Burnap Cottage. We think it was now Sr. In the timeline, it mentions about Reverend Gatewood occasionally coming, an itinerant preacher, coming and giving services at Burnap Cottage. He also, we found out, had, after his preaching days, he and his wife had a store on the end of a dock on Reed's Landing. And they would sell, it was like a 7-Eleven type place. It was little. It wasn't a big store, like Bailey's, but they did sell things. And he even had a chair that he'd pull out and would pull teeth for islanders that had. So lots of stories. And it's fun because when you're doing a project like this, you come up with all kinds of just fun, cool stuff. It was bought and sold several different times, as you can tell from the Burnap Cottage. After the Brewsters, it was rented out occasionally. One of the fellas that lived in it and died in it, his name is Lee Greer. And I'm not going to tell you his story because if you come to the Twilight Talk March 15th, you'll hear a little bit more about Lee Greer, a character. Let's see. Two fun things that happened in Burnap Cottage, and this was in the 70s. One I found out in my dentist's office. He gives away Gulf Shore Life magazine. And so I was reading the May issue and found out, had no idea, when Iki Matsumoto, the artist, first came to Sanibel, he and his young family rented Burnap Cottage. And there's pictures of him in it. And it was white, it wasn't green. But there are quite a few, pictures of Burnap Cottage and talking about it. And he has this.
The whole book that somebody sees in the Star is just written.
Yes. His daughter, yeah, I think did it. But we had no idea here. Most of us, I don't think, knew that he lived in Burnap Cottage. They also, in 75, which was when they were there was a movie that was filmed on Woodring Point, scenes from the movie Night Moves with Gene Hackman, and I think Melanie Griffin was in it also. And Chris will remember because Ralph was telling us this the other day, but when the film crew, Hollywood crew, came in to film it, it was really fun. They didn't really get much of a permission to do it. They just kind of moved on in, and and the Woodring said, this is cool. So, and Melanie used to. There was talk that she used to swim in her bathing suit in Woodring Point in the Tarpon Bay there. So, I don't know. Anyway, be interesting. Yeah, and then there are lots of fun things that we found out about Esperanza, but you'll find out things like that. I won't go into all of those. One other thing, it says in our local docent's book that LeClaire Bissell was the one that donated the cottage. I didn't know anything about this woman. I thought it was a man. And I asked Ralph, and he said, no, she was a woman. And she had a friend, Nancy Palmer. They were doctors from New York City, and they had bought Burnap Cottage, and they were the ones that donated the cottage to the village. And that was in 1995, and then it was located in 1996 to the village. Okay. Okay.
Were you going to join me? You know what, I'll pop up there, but I think you know as much as I do. Well, you're. Yes. I am talking about the Rutland House. And of course, it also morphs into the Rutland family history. Othman Rutland moved his family here from Apopka, Florida, after the big freeze up there, and he rented a house on the Ween homestead on Periwinkle Way. In 1899, he passed away, and his widow, Irene, along with her 5 children, raised turkeys on Sanibel. Othman is actually buried on the property over near Periwinkle Park. You'll find an amazing gravestone there, kind of across the street from the Dairy Queen.
Where's the gravesite?
Across the street from the Dairy Queen, just on the street side of Periwinkle Park. Yeah.
There's a headstone or something there?
Yes, yes. It's actually in the information center that the bike club put together, a number of years ago. But
Yes,
we,
and Mary, I will throw in, it's almost certain that as the headstone says, he was born in England, he was not. So I don't know if that comes from a Clarence Tolton, but he was not.
easy come, easy go.
It is engraved forever in that headstone.
Okey doke. Well, Clarence Rutland actually dropped out of school after the 3rd grade. And at that time, he was making 7 cents an hour packing vegetables and tomatoes with the Sanibel Packing Company. 7 cents an hour at the age of about 9 or 10. So that was the extent of his education. In 1900, he married lighthouse keeper Henry Shanahan, Irene, and she was the widow with 5 children. So this blended family ended up being 13 children. It was large. And at about that time, too, the Rutland House, let me back up and say the Rutland House is a typical cracker-style architecture. One central long hall, high ceilings, rooms and windows across from each other. No air conditioning. The air conditioning was opening the front and back door.
Thank you, Bill. That's a really interesting tidbit on that, because it was the situation. And now we have Ginny Darby, and Ginny's gonna share some, talk about getting
August
into
7th,
research. This is something,
1916,
our cemeteries on the island that we really haven't known a lot about before. You've got into detail, so we appreciate having you share some things.
Wiles in Spalding County, Georgia. And in 1928, Clarence purchases the house, and to do that, he got a loan from Frank Bailey for $1,800. The house cost $80 to build, 80 to build, but he bought it for $1,800. And he says that he bought this house at the end of World War I and very slowly paid it off at the end of World War II. So it was hard for him to come up with this money. While he was living in the house, this is another little Clarence Rutland fact, he sold ark shells. And in that long hallway in the house, there's these barrels of ark shells there, kind of making point of this. But he sold them to Thomas Edison and to make walkways over at the Edison estate for 50 cents for 60 pounds of ark shells. When he raised the price to $1 for 60 pounds of ark shells, Thomas Edison said that was too expensive. He wasn't buying any more. So I don't know about Clarence's marketing skills.
That's okay, how much were they, he sold them initially for how many, 60?
50 cents for 60 pounds of arc shells. If you wonder where all the arc shells went. Yeah. And sadly, in 1958, he and Ruth, as I said, were married, had no children of their own after coming from this blended family of 13. But I think every child on the island thought of Clarence as Uncle Clarence, and they would be wandering through the house all the time. But sadly, Ruth passed away in 1958, and Clarence lived until the early 80s by himself. And the Sanibel Historical Museum and Village moved the Rutland House here. It was actually the first building to come to the museum. And sadly, the only thing in the entire house that belonged to Clarence is his rocking chair. All the other furniture and goods in the house are of the period, but it's only his rocking chair that belonged to him. And if you sit in, not to sit in it, but if you look at that rocking chair, and it wouldn't be hard to guess that Clarence wasn't more than 5'4" or 5'5". It's just a tiny chair, but it's beautifully inlaid with shells and turquoise and gorgeous. Any questions about the Rutland House? Yes.
I had one story for you on
Oh.
the selling of shells to Thomas Edison.
Yeah.
I did tours there, and they said that Thomas Edison believed snakes didn't like crawling over these arc shells, and that's why he wanted them around the house.
Ah, so they had a real purpose until they got too expensive, and then so be it. Yes.
So who gave the Rutland House to the Historical Society?
The Mensch family. Yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Where exactly did it sit?
It,
I mean, the bicycle
yeah.
area, they've got information there about it. It didn't sit there though, did it?
Yes.
Where it was?
Yeah, it was on the Wren property just this side of Periwinkle Park, so
It was not across from the Dairy Queen. I used to say it was, no, it's where the bicycle.
maybe next to She Sells Seashells. Yeah, in that area. Yeah, in that area. Yeah.
Do you know if the barn that is in, there's a real old wooden barn over the fence inside Periwinkle Park. And I've heard that that was Clarence Rutland's farm.
I don't know anything about the barn. I don't think I've ever seen it.
We can find out about it.
Yeah, Clarence's barn. Didn't know he had one. Yeah. Any other questions?
Mary, do we have any idea what happened to the furniture? Why, he must have had,
Probably didn't have much.
you don't think?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. There should have been more of it around. Yes.
Impression I had, because we had a place there, Ben still do, but
Mm-hmm.
I had the impression it was really pretty dilapidated.
Hmm.
He lived
By the
That
by
figures.
himself for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
They probably just tossed it.
Yeah.
Never put in indoor plumbing.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. You're welcome.
And I skipped over the schoolhouse, so now Judy's gonna teach us a little bit about the schoolhouse.
As you look at your timeline, it says in 1888, a petition was received to start a school district on Sanibel from the Lee County Board. The following September, a site was ordered for the school, and a structure was supposed to be built of 16 by 24 by 12 feet at a price not to exceed $75. Well, that school was built and sometime later, just because it took a while to get that school built, because just like so many things in government and communities, there was an argument about where that school was supposed to be situated. Some people wanted it down by the lighthouse. Some people wanted two schools, one out west, one around the Bailey Road, and that's where it ended up being. There may have been two schools, another one out at, I can't remember the name of the little enclave out on the west end of the village, Wolford. But even kids that lived out on Captiva came to our school. In 1891, Miss Letitia Nutt was hired to be the first teacher. In 1894, that school blew down, and we didn't have a school for a little while. In 1896, a new school was built near Bailey Road and Periwinkle. It was built on wheels. In 1902, the building was moved on its wheels and a hoist down Periwinkle, just east of Tahitian Gardens, where it stayed for many years. It was used as a school until 1963 when integration came to Sanibel. Again, it was the first school in Lee County to be integrated. The reason being, the people on the island said there was so much conflict about building the causeway. They didn't want to have any more conflict. So the people of Sanibel wanted to be united, and they integrated the new school. I brought along one of my favorite books on Sanibel, and especially the Historical Museum, written by Frances Bailey. Frances Bailey was probably one of the most maybe infamous students at the school. And I just wanted to read a couple of things that he wrote in his book about the school. He said it was a one-room school, and there was a library with about a dozen books in it. So maybe we should call it a book room instead of a library. There was one room, one school, one door, one cabinet, one pencil sharpener, but a two-hole outhouse. And one of the things that Francis got into trouble for doing was he and a couple of the other boys would find a pole, put it under the outhouse when the girls were in it, and start rocking the outhouse. And it says in the book, he got into a lot of trouble on that one. You also might have heard the story that he picked up a dead snake from the playground and put it in the teacher's drawer, desk drawer, and that got him in even more trouble. But Francis went on to say, I went to an academically challenging prep school, and I didn't have any real problem with the work there. So the Sanibel School must have done a good job. And there are, I want to just put a little plug in for the gift shop, because if you don't have this book, it's really wonderful. And there are so many other books that I've purchased there that I've learned a lot of things about Sanibel. And then the school was used as a theater from '64 until it was moved over to the village here in 2004. And that is the story of the school.
Thank you. Nancy, we'll have Shorehaven.
Yeah, I'm going to stand over here where there's less breeze. Okay, you can see the timeline, and the big story here is the money, okay? When Daisy and Ross bought the house, they paid $4,000 for it. So when I was researching the house, I went down all these rabbit holes like you can't believe. And I found out that it was what they call honor built, B-I-L-T. So I thought it was somebody's name. That was just the top of the line of the Sears catalog houses. Okay, now I'm going down on the rabbit hole, and you're all going with me. They had three other levels. One was standard, which was below the honor built, and the outhouses were separate, so you had to buy those separately. And then there was something called the simplex sectional, which was a tiny house. So see, tiny houses are not new, okay? Okay, and this model was a Verona. It was built in 1924. They moved in with their 5 children, and Daisy lived in it until 1969. Then it sat vacant for about 8 years, and Doris and Robert Potts purchased the home Now, that's somebody we don't really talk too much about, but they were interesting in that they came from Pennsylvania, as did the mayors. Okay, and they own Hucksters, R&B Liquors, and they started Island Realty because he was in the real estate business. Okay, and Mrs. Dormer agreed to sell them the house. And they refurbished it. It took them 3 years to refurbish it and just kind of make it nicer. And she lived in a trailer on the property until they refurbished the house. And I found another little interesting tidbit when I read her obituary. She was a quilter. So we can, okay. But they kept the lighting and they moved, what they did is they flipped the house back to front. So I'm sure we all know all of that. And then it just kept going and price and price and price. And then the last people donated it to us. Any questions? Yeah.
How did we get the $3.65 million?
They got lucky is what happened.
The location.
Yeah,
And
it's location, location, location.
It was on the Zonta tour.
Yes, I remember.
And that, I mean, we always tell people, you can see this original Sears concept. You see it there the way it was 100 years ago, and you see it there in the granite countertop era, and amazing that these little houses could do. It was it was very lovely on the Zonta tour.
Yeah, but they said with when the Sears company, you know, released these plans, nothing was innovative, nothing, it was just, they stamped it out, yeah.
I think it's important also because the other thing that I found, these two houses were side by side, so they were both on the bay, which is why they're $3.5 million at some
Mhm.
point. But the other piece that I found is someplace around 1929 to 1930, you know, Bay Road, I
Mhm.
think that's the right name, went in front of these houses, between the house
And the bay.
and in 1929, they swapped property that was in front for property behind, and that's why the current Bay Road goes behind those houses.
Yeah.
So that helps add value to it.
This is on Woodbury Point, right?
No,
This is
it's on
Bailey
Bay Road.
Road.
Just
And
go
then
left.
Bay Road,
Mhm.
where they were originally, down there by the wharf.
Nancy?
Yeah.
Let me just tell everybody another interesting story. I was on the board, this is the first year I was on the board, when this house was up for being transferred here to the village. The Cassidy family that owned the house were Canadians. And apparently tax laws are different in Canada than they are in the United States. And they had to petition the country, Canada, to get permission to be able to deduct the difference between the value of the house and what we paid for it. And it was pretty dramatic, the difference. And they finally agreed to, the Canadian government agreed to give them a tax deduction for their donation of that house to the village. But it was delayed a long time getting it here to the village because of that issue. So that's a very interesting story.
then we had to get
Alex
it here in
Werner
6
was
weeks.
president of the village at that point, and he just got very, very frustrated with the Canadians and the Cassidys because it was taking so long to get approval to move it here to the village.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. That's a really interesting tidbit on that because it was the situation. And now we have Ginny Darby, and Ginny's going to share some, talk about getting into research. This is something, our cemeteries on the island that we really haven't known a lot about before, and you've got into detail, so we appreciate having you share some things.
Hello. Every time we have an event out here, it is cold. If you came to the Twilight Talks last year, it was freezing. So that's just the way it is. When Gail started, she said, the stories of Sanibel are ours to tell. And that is so true. It's a small island. It was a small town. The more research you do, the more you realize early on people were related by blood and they were related by marriage. So there was a really close knit, very wonderful community. That said, there were lots of times when they weren't speaking to one another. The Rutland House, the Rutlands have fascinated me, and Nancy will tell you there's this historical book about the Rutlands coming here. They were an interesting family. Othmar, the father, who is buried along Periwinkle, was named after an Ottoman sultan. Isaac Newton Rutland is buried in the cemetery, and he named after Isaac Newton. So this was a family that wasn't a backwoods. They may have been backwoods from west of Apopka, Florida, but they had some chops. And at Rutland House, I was fascinated by Clarence and then his brother, who is buried under the name Newton Rutland in the cemetery. And I would guess all of us, is there anyone here who has not walked or ridden by the Pioneer Cemetery? Okay, Gail, we'll take a walk. Okay, the Pioneer Cemetery, and you'll see people ride by and stop on their bank, and stop and look, and they're quiet and they're introspective. We look at the huge marker there of Isaac Newton. I had so many questions about it. And it is a modern Woodman sculpture monument. It stands about this high. It was used by early aviators who came to land on the airstrip. It was used as a landmark. Then they knew that just to their right, that's where the airfield was, and they would land there. He died at 23. And I looked and looked. It took a long time, but we found the obituary. And interestingly, and you can read some of this on there, a young man of 23 years of age died on Saturday after a short illness of only 2 days. An operation was performed by Doctors Winkler and Henry in Fort Myers as the only chance of saving his life. All efforts were useless. What was that? Appendix, gallbladder? Who knows? But life was hard. Those stories we cherish. Interestingly, it said he leaves a mother, brother, and sister to lament his untimely death. What happened to the other 2 siblings in that family? And so all of these questions arise, and other questions. You know, the children, the 4 children buried there, and then infant after infant after infant. And to the best of what I can figure, infant would go anywhere up to age 2 or 3. Stillbirths or very shortly after death, often they didn't name those children, and that would be infant without a name. The infant with a name, they were usually 2 to 3 years old. And sad, and if our cemetery is sad, the Captiva Cemetery, if you have not walked around there, that tells a story too. So we continue to tell Sanibel's story. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Reed family, because we have talked about the Reeds, and we can get the idea of the cemetery from the Reeds. William Haskell Reed came with his son, William Sumner Reed, to Homestead in the late 1800s, 1898, I think. They came here, bought land south of Woodrings, and then they built had a homestead built, and he sent for his wife, Lucy, from Deer Isle, Maine. I did find online photos of the graves of 2 little girls who still remain in Deer Island, Maine, in that cemetery. One was 2 and one was 3. So Lucy left with the 2 remaining children, both in their 20s, and one was Florence Lucy, and the other one was Eugene. And William, the son, was still here on the island with his father. They joined them, and all was lovely. She had 3 of her 5 children with her until Eugene, age 21, was in a sailing accident, and he was drowned. So hard lives. And these stories, they're very compelling. There's more over, if you haven't visited over by the packing house, if you haven't visited there and read that, there's some additional stuff there that's quite interesting and definitely worth a trip. I want, and while we're talking about it, and you'll see there are little wooden discs that indicate all of the known graves that are there in the Pioneer Cemetery. We only see the South Ridge. The North Ridge is in the woods. I want to go check for it, but I understand there's so much poison ivy, so I've got to figure out how to get a hazmat suit to get back there and see it. One other just wonderful quirky story, Florence Lucy, the girl who came down and settled with the Reeds, she married Bert Daniels. He was a farmer, and she saw him killed by a drunken farmhand. In 1907. It was a good crop that year, and with profits from the pepper farm, she was able to buy, I think they called it the Floating Palace, which was a houseboat hotel, which then was docked out there on the bayfront. These people's stories are phenomenal. Our library, if you go into their digital archives, you can find photos and transcripts of interviews and fascinating things. One other read, the one that we see, the photo where they have the hut and the two men are sitting outside it on Tarpon Bay. One of those was Commodore Edwin Reed, no relation to the other Reed family. He too, like the senior Reed, was a veteran of the Civil War. He lived in that thatched hut. He grew a garden. He fished on from his little dock and read voraciously. When he died, no one came for his body, and I can't find where he is buried. So just sad story after sad story. Again, the story of life and death. When I was standing over there by the display and we were talking about Yvette Cookie Redinger, the 10-year-old girl who we all wonder about. Apparently she was born with congenital heart problems. And I was fortunate enough to have Deb Gleason there, and she was standing there, and she said, "Oh yes," I won't tell you what she said, but we're standing in front of this sacred display, and Deb Gleason is telling me about Cookie's mother, who gave her tips on finding men. So, there's all of this good stuff to be found out on the island that is fascinating, that is fun. I will, and if anyone after we're finished wants to go over there, we can take a look at that. One of the things I'd like to leave you with is this sense of story, this sense of place, this very, very special place where we are privileged to live. We owe it to the people on whose shoulders we stand to maintain and to share those stories. I was standing, as all of us do, in my kitchen with the acrylic Mod Podge, and I was, putting things over these wooden discs to hang up, crafting, and I just had this moment, and it was like a little ripple in the cosmos, and as I was going over the 4 children, I thought, has anyone thought about these 4 children in many, many decades? And I thought, I'm thinking about them. I don't know their story. I don't know their mother's story, their father's story, their time on Sanibel, but I do know we're honoring them. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we all need to do at this village. We need to share and celebrate Sanibel's history with all those people who come to love this place as we do. So thank you.